Thank you, Sam, for the introduction. Good morning and good afternoon and good evening to all of our colleagues joining us from around the world. Welcome to the CANSO Communication, Navigation, and Surveillance Work Group, also known as the CNS Work Group webinar on space-based voice technologies. As Sam mentioned, I am Nikki Harry-Charon, the CANSO's Operation Program Manager, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's session. We are very excited to have 291 registered attendees from every region of the world, representing air navigation service providers, industry stakeholders, and international organizations. This global interest highlights the growing monument around space-based voice technologies and their critical role in the future of aviation communications. Today's webinar is a forward-looking discussion on the potential and progress of space-based voice communication in air traffic management. As aviation continues to evolve to meet the demands of growing traffic, new entrants, and the need for seamless global coverage, satellite-enabled voice technologies offer promising solutions that extend our communication capabilities far beyond the limitations of terrestrial infrastructure. Our session today will provide an overview of the operational need for space-based voice, outline the benefits for both ANSPs and airspace users, and explore satellite voice and space-based VHF. We'll also look ahead to the next steps in collaboration, integration, and implementation as these technologies move from concept to operational reality. For those who may be new to CANSO, the Civil Air Navigation Services Organization, as mentioned in the video earlier, apologies for no sound, we are the global voice of air traffic management. CANSO members provide air navigation services to over 90% of the world's air traffic. We work closely with ICAO and a broad range of stakeholders, sharing information, shaping policies, and promoting best practices to improve safety and efficiency across the global aviation ecosystem. We encourage you to submit questions in the chat throughout the session. Our presenters will respond during the Q&A portion after the presentation. This session will be recorded and sent to all registered attendees. So now let's start to dive into today's content. I'm very pleased to introduce two exceptional speakers who will guide us through today's session. Lisa B. is Viasat's Director of Air Traffic Services and co-chair of the CANSO CNS Work Group. With over 30 years of experience in air traffic management, Lisa also serves as CANSO's representative to the ICAO Operational Data Link Working Group and advises several other ICAO work groups. She chairs the informal South Pacific Air Traffic Coordination Group, Future Air Navigation Service Interoperability Team, and brings a global perspective to data link and communication evolution in air traffic management. Craig Benson is the co-founder and Chief Innovation Officer at Skycraft. He holds a PhD in electrical engineering from the University of New South Wales and has been instrumental in pioneering space-based VHF development. And just to prove his endurance isn't limited to the lab, Craig recently completed the 89-kilometer Comrades Marathon race in South Africa. Congratulations, Craig. I'll now hand over the virtual floor to Lisa and Craig, and they'll start the agenda for today. Lisa?
Thank you, Nikki. And welcome everyone to today's webinar on space-based voice. I'll be providing you a quick introduction and kind of overview to set the context for today's webinar. I'll then be focusing on satellite voice advances, and then turn the webinar over to Craig, where he'll talk to you about space-based VHF and then provide a summary of today's webinar. Next. And next. So today's air traffic management system is supported by three pillars of capabilities, and that enables safe and efficient operations. The first is communication, in addition to navigation and surveillance. And these capabilities together provide the foundation for air traffic services. Today, we're going to be focusing on communication, and specifically voice communications. Next. So I think we're all familiar with communication capabilities in domestic airspace. They're supported primarily by VHF radio line of sight, voice and data communications. And the data communications include controller pilot data link communications. In some areas of the world, they're also integrating L-band SATCOM into the data communications portion of those capabilities. But today, we're going to be focusing on oceanic and remote airspace communications, which traditionally have been supported by HF for voice and data, as well as L-band satellite voice for non-routine and emergency backup purposes, and L-band satellite communications for data link capabilities, including controller pilot data link communications. And the L-band SATCOM data communications has been an enabler for higher efficiency operations in oceanic and remote airspace. They are an enabler for reduced separation that meets performance-based criteria, and for operations such as user-preferred routes and dynamic airborne rerouting procedures. Next. Some of the benefits of satellite-based communications today are achieved by capabilities that meet performance-based separation criteria. Without SATCOM that meets performance-based communications and surveillance criteria, separation minima in the ocean is typically 50 to 80 nautical miles or even greater. But with SATCOM meeting PBCS requirements, capabilities for far more efficient operations are possible. For example, a configuration that utilizes ADS-C that meets RSP 180 and CPDLC that meets the required communication performance, RCP 240, along with RNP4 capabilities, can bring separation minima in the realm of 12 to 23 nautical miles lateral and 15 to 20 miles longitudinally. Pairing CPDLC with ADS-B, space-based ADS-B specifically, and RNP4 capabilities, you get similar types of separation minima, a new 15 nautical mile target-to-target separation minima, and separation minima in the 14 to nautical mile range, longitudinally and laterally. So you can see that with data link meeting the performance-based communication requirements, far more efficient operations are possible. Next. Space-based voice can be added to this mix and support these more efficient operations in the ocean. A new RCP is being developed to enable this, and the potential for satellite voice and for space-based VHF as enablers for these separations are on the horizon, on the near horizon, actually. And this is also consistent with recent ICAO objectives at the last Air Navigation Conference in the fall. ICAO announced an initiative to encourage and facilitate implementation of 30 nautical mile minimum separation in oceanic airspace for purposes of achieving greater efficiency and also harmonization in operations. Next slide. So today we're going to focus on direct controller pilot voice communications, and again, I'll be talking about satellite voice, and Craig will be talking about space-based VHF. Next. So traditionally, satellite voice, which as I mentioned, has been used for non-routine operations, such as emergencies or a backup to HF, have occurred using a two-stage dial-up capability through the public switch telephone network, and that's to connect radio operators with the ground earth stations at the satellite service at the satellite network. So the two-stage dial-up has to use a PIN for authorization and security, and then that can be associated with a caller line identification. Additionally, a radio operator is used between the air traffic controller and the aircraft to relay the voice communications. It takes about 60 seconds for the ground to air call setup, and that's from the time the radio operator sends the call message to the annunciation on the flight deck. That's basically when the SATCOM call starts to ring on the flight deck. And so it's, and that's even with automated dial sequences. That two-stage dial-up capability takes some time. Next. In recent years, there has been an effort to bypass the two-stage secure dialer and implement a voice over IP connection that bypasses the public switch telephone network. So there's a voice internet protocols, what we call SIP signaling process that has now been implemented. It provides a secure one-stage dialing capability on private networks. It avoids the public switch telephone network. It avoids that two-stage kind of lengthy secure dialing process, and it reliably carries priority, call priority, and caller line identification. And the call priority is important because that tells the system how to route it, whether and what priority to give it in terms of, is it for an emergency or air traffic high communication, or is it for a more or a less urgent airline operation type communications. The actual call setup time using this capability is in the realm of a 5 to 6 seconds. And the capability enables direct controller pilot voice communications. It can also be used with the radio operator, but it does provide that capability. Currently, it has been implemented by CETA, and Collins is evaluating the service in an operational trial with the FAA. The capability is aligned with a proposal for amendment that is currently in coordination to ICAO Annex 10, Volume 3. And additionally, the ICAO Operational Data Link Working Group is developing a new voice RCP for direct controller pilot communications that would be supportive of this technology. So again, this is a capability that has been developed and is in service. And again, using satellite voice, the way a controller and a pilot would speak would be akin to a telephone conversation. So the controller would hit a send button, the call would be connected onto the flight deck, the pilot would see an indication that a call is coming in, pick up the phone, and the two of them would have a conversation, could have a conversation as if they were on a telephone call. Next slide. So this is a mature technology. There's no changes to the satellite capability. There's no changes to the equipment on the aircraft. It's really an integration effort between the voice switch at the air navigation facility. And so Nav Canada was the first to implement this capability, and they have it fully implemented. They have a one-stage secure voice connectivity, and they have the capability for direct controller pilot communications. However, because there is not a standard in place at this point in time, they can't use it for separation. CAA Singapore began operational trials with CETA in 2019, and they continue to provide data to support the ICAO development of standards and recommended practices. Additionally, the FAA is conducting an operational trial with Collins of the one-stage secure VoIP connectivity. So we've got a number of airlines participating with the FAA. Singapore has had a number of airlines participating, and both communication service providers. CETA has fully implemented the capability, and Collins is currently trialing it. At this point in time, the proposal for amendment for Annex 10, Volume 3 is in coordination with the Air Navigation Commission, and the Operational Data Link Working Group is developing an RCP to support direct controller pilot voice communications. Next. So now I'll turn the control over to Craig, and he'll talk to you about space-based VHF.
Thank you. So thank you for your patience there. Welcome to the webinar. The purpose of our space-based VHF, then next slide, is to try to reuse the existing fit on the aircraft. So the whole concept of space-based VHF is that you do not modify the fleet of aircraft. And in fact, the experience for the air traffic controller and for the pilot is the same as the terrestrial VHF. The latency is similar. The press to talk experience is roughly the same, and as long as the desired operational coverage is of this scale of no more than a few thousand kilometers across, then you get the all-informed behavior that you also get out of VHF, which may or may not be desirable over the oceans, and it is also possible to select to do cell call, because most of the VHF radios are actually fitted with cell call, even though it's not actually implemented as a general basis. So the idea is to reuse the existing VHF on all of the aircraft, which means that you're not just limited to large airliners from major airlines. You also get coverage for small regional turboprops, for general aviation, and other aircraft that are used often in the lower traffic density parts of the world, the South Pacific, parts of Africa, the New Guinea highlands, all these sorts of things where you can actually talk to things all the way down to a Cessna, because their VHF radio is still the same. So we get full global coverage from 2 out of the 3 planned constellations at the moment. It required a rule change at WRC 23 from the International Telecommunications Union, and thanks to a lot of support from the aviation organisations around the world, that was readily agreed at the end of 2023. And the SARPs, so modifications of Volume 3 and Volume 5 of Annex 10 are in process, and should go through at the same time as the SARPs that Lisa was talking about for Volume 3, with submission roughly the end of this year and applicability in about 2028. So all of the planned operations operate from LEO satellites, low Earth orbit satellites, that are 500 to 800 kilometers above the Earth. And they move around the Earth, which is the reason everybody's basically planning on offering global coverage. You can't provide regional coverage. The general intent is to have multiple satellites in view. And when I say general, each of the satellite operators has different operating plans. I'm basically talking to our plan, but it's similar to the others. So we have multiple satellites in view, choose the best transmitter and receiver for each part of airspace, making sure we get the best possible signal into the area of coverage, as well as mitigating the interference to other potential interference to other users in other airspaces, because satellites have the advantage of a very large field of view, and that comes with the disadvantage that you also have a very large area you could potentially interfere with for spectrum planning. Next slide. So from the ANSP air traffic control perspective, the experience for the air traffic controller is the same as existing VHF, if you want it to be. And the constellations actually plug into the voice switch and the air traffic control system using the existing Euro-K standards and so on. So it really just looks like a remote VHF system. When combined with, for example, space-based VHF, then what you get is a service that resembles terrestrial airspace. So you get similar performances to the ones Lisa was talking about. And this is one of the main economic drivers for improving the remote area communication, whether it is from geostationary satellite over L-band or whether it's space-based VHF. And in fact, there are use cases, for example, where you may choose to use both of them because it gives you a dual redundant capability and the advantage to delete HF without any adopting any new major risks from the new technologies. We end up with very large coverage areas if desired, and at very large areas you could use communicators, so professional radio operators as per HF, and then they can forward the messages on and off to air traffic control, or you can patch the VHF directly through to the air traffic controller. There are also areas where you have terrestrial VHF at the moment, and Australia, for example, has this problem where you have very large airspaces. Some of our individual airspaces for a single controller are, for example, the size of France. And you have multiple terrestrial VHF signals on multiple frequencies trying to cover that area. And so you can replace that and do it with a single satellite beam on a single frequency. There's also a lot of advantages where ground infrastructure is lacking, particularly where there isn't power and data to remote sites and it becomes very difficult. There may be security problems. That could either be crime or it could be a fact that there's a low-level insurgency and it's not possible to send technicians into part of the country in spite of the fact that you've still got a national government providing air traffic control services for its population. So this certainly helps with the no country left behind. From a pilot or airline perspective, again, the experience is the same as if you're talking to the air traffic control tower on departure, or approach or en route somewhere. You get similar squelch, and we can use cell call if in remote or en route over the oceans, for example, the pilots don't want to be bothered with everybody else's communications. Then it is possible to implement cell call rather than all informed. So you get very responsive interactions in oceanic airspace. And there's scope to reduce HF carriage, which has both weight and maintenance savings. And that could also be including, for example, existing L-band systems and so on, where you choose to delete the HF for the weight saving and fall over to a combined L-band VHF solution. There's also scope to reduce special SATCOM fits for occasional oceanic work. So, for example, in Australia, we service a lot of the Pacific Islands with 737s that would otherwise fly solely domestic routes that don't need a remote area communication fit. And some parts of Europe have the same problem. They want to be able to send aircraft occasionally out to some of the Atlantic Islands that they don't want to go and fit SATCOM to their entire 737 or A320 fleet. Of course, if you've got an aircraft that flies over the ocean all the time, then L-band SATCOM makes a lot of sense, but it doesn't necessarily for terrestrial aircraft or domestic aircraft. There's also scope to serve company frequencies and especially aggregating those over global alliances. So the Star Alliance, One World, for example, some of these airlines that play well together could actually share company frequencies and end up with company frequencies that can be operated over very large areas. There's also scope for VDL Mode 2 everywhere, even at small fields, because of course one of the problems with VDL Mode 2 is that you need to be within range of a terrestrial radio station. And while at altitude this is reasonable in large areas, it doesn't work at small fields, and certainly in I'll call them low wealth density parts of the world, which includes Australia. VDL Mode 2 is not available on the ground at most of our aerodromes. It's only the major airfields where you can get it. Next slide, please. So all's not sweetness and light. There are some issues with bringing in space-based VHF that particularly the ANSPs need to be aware of. And I've been working quite closely with the frequency spectrum panel in trying to make sure that we can mitigate these effects and bring in this service for the benefits that it provides economically without adding unnecessarily to the congestion of frequencies in the major areas of Europe, North America, China, and so on. So we're most suited to broad area oceanic and remote uses. The southern hemisphere is almost a free fire zone. The northern hemisphere can be quite tricky to work around areas where frequency congestion is a major problem. The VDL Mode 2 implementation on the satellite needs to be a little different to on the ground. The aircraft remain unmodified and the systems are interoperable, but the protocol that's used there is marginally different in detail. But again, that is almost completely hidden to the user behind the implementation by the service provider. And of course, the timelines, World Radio Conference allowed the rule change to bring space-based VHF into being. There's three companies that are currently talking about providing services. Arion, of course, who are currently provide a space-based ADS-B service from Iridium Next, are currently doing workshops and planning with their ANSP shareholders to define a CONOPS and have plans to launch a constellation of up to 20 satellites in 2028. Startical have 2 tech demo satellites, one of which is currently in orbit, The other one is strapped onto a Falcon 9 rocket at Vandenberg Space Force Base and should launch on Saturday, weather permitting and so on, but it'll certainly be up in the next few days. And it's the larger of their 2 tech demo satellites. The first tech demo satellite actually recently did the first live air traffic control to pilot voice and data over space-based VHF. Skycraft, where I work, we've launched 10 tech demo satellites already and have another 5 that are currently being integrated onto the rocket at Vandenberg Space Force Base. So they're currently about 400 meters from where the Startical ones are, and they will launch in late July this year. So in sort of about 30 to 40 days. And our constellation's planned for the end of 2026. And again, the ICAO SARPs at volumes 3 and 5 have PFAs that are planned for applicability in late 2028, and we're working on those in Montreal next week. So next slide. So in conclusion, if we move to the next slide. In this webinar, we've covered 2 different approaches to space-based voice communication, and they have different properties, or in many ways are mutually compatible, because they attack the problem from different directions and allow you to solve different problems depending on what the unique situation is. So Lisa spoke about satellite voice, and in the ICAO SARP, satellite voice specifically basically means the L-band system. So the old Inmarsat, now Viasat, that Lisa runs. And the Iridium option as well, and cockpit voice and data. The ICAO SARPs again are being developed, and we've spoken to that in detail. Space-based VHF is under development, and a number of tech demo satellites have been launched. So there's 11 been launched so far, and another 6 going up in the next month and a half. And so we're rapidly proving out that capability. More are planned, and full constellation soon. So the benefits here of our space-based systems is you're not constrained by line of sight propagation. So you get coverage in oceanic or remote airspace, as well as, for example, all the way down to ground levels, not necessarily on the ground for VHF, but certainly on the ground for L-band SATCOM, and down to close to the ground for VHF in all areas, which means that you don't get these dead zones away from major population centres. And like I say, for the low wealth density parts of the Earth, and that includes Canada and Australia. It's not just countries that don't have a lot of money, it's countries that have a lot more land than they have money, is kind of the insight. We get fast air-to-ground controller voice communication with the new improved L-band SATCOM systems, a very fast call setup. These then allow us to fly aircraft at more optimal flight profiles, cost and emission reductions primarily through reduced fuel burn, also slightly faster flight times. And of course, these are again driving that reduced aircraft equipment fit, and deleting HF off aircraft in the foreseeable future is a major boon for airlines, because every pound of aircraft fit you can reduce increases the number of passengers you can carry. And of course, this becomes increasingly important as aircraft start to fly 15, 16, 18 to 20 hours. It's those super long routes where every pound really matters. Shorter routes is not so critical. So this increases flexibility and efficiency, allowing the industry to continue its very impressive long-term march towards ever more affordable and ever safer air traffic for the public. And of course, you get those abilities to manage weather and unplanned deviations and so on. Pilots can request approval to move around weather at very short notice with not too much friction. So that'll wrap up. We'll hand back to Nikki, I believe, and then we can take some questions.
Thank you very much, both Craig and Lisa, for that great presentation. We did have a few questions that came into the chat box, and I'll start with, can you elaborate more on how the issue of interference will be handled, considering the footprint of satellite-based VHF for a given frequency will be much larger than ground-based radio?
Yeah, so while the interference areas are quite large, so are the areas of coverage, so the DOC. And we've been working through this at the ICAO FSMP, so the frequency spectrum planning. You end up with similar frequency reuse rates for space-based VHF as you do for terrestrial VHF. When I say similar, they're not necessarily identical, but they're certainly of the same order. So while it's very easy to say, oh, you've got a 3,000 kilometre line of sight to the interference horizon, you're also servicing DOCs that might be 1,000 kilometres on each side. So it doesn't necessarily scale badly. The main difficulty is when you get close to those very congested areas in Europe and North America and China. Certainly is a rapidly growing market that'll have similar problems going forward. And generally, what we'll do for those is you service those from outside the area where you get most interference. So in general, we try to service from the southern hemisphere where the congestion is nowhere near as bad. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any benchmarks or case studies showing the cost-benefit analysis of implementing satellite-based VHF, especially for low-traffic FIRS?
Generally, so I can talk to what Skycraft do. So we largely price per flight hour, knowing that there's a requirement on the ANSP not to divide up their airspace into thousands of small cells that we need individual frequencies for, because we need to provide a satellite for each of those cells. But generally, we're pretty much aligned to the traffic density. So because the cost of having this constellation on orbit is roughly fixed, then it doesn't make sense to charge the same price in the north per area. It doesn't make the same sense to charge the same price in the North Atlantic as it does in the South Pacific. The South Pacific we can basically service at almost no additional cost. So therefore we can service very low density traffic in a very affordable way because we're charging per flight hour, not per square kilometre.
Thank you. Sorry, these questions are coming in. So with discussions around removing all HF radios from aircraft, have there been safety discussions about the increased reliance on space-based systems? CNS would have all direct reliance on satellites, which can have common failure modes, example, solar activity.
So I can talk a little bit about that. The discussion around removal of HF, that's a longer term discussion, and there'll be some significant safety analysis done. At this point in time, there's no ICAO requirement that limits, that would require carriage of HF. However, because SATCOM is a recognized long-range communication system. However, there are no states that currently allow it. And obviously an operator has to make sure that they meet the equipment requirements for their entire route of flight. So it's going to take some time. As far as common failure modes, when you're talking about satellite communications, you're talking about things like dual redundancy, for example. In the oceanic environment right now, there are areas that require dual long-range communication systems. And as Craig alluded to or mentioned in his portion of the talk, one of those configuration strategies could be an L-band SATCOM voice solution paired with space-based VHF. Those are very different types of systems. They're completely segregated. They have different advantages and different vulnerabilities, different strengths. There are concerns about solar interference, for example, and sometimes HF can be affected by solar interference. I know with our geosynchronous satellites that Viasat operates, we're far less vulnerable to solar or space weather interference, and the satellites are protected from it. The geosynchronous orbits is less prone to interference. And you pair that with another type of capability, a LEO capability, whether it's an Iridium LEO or whether it's a space-based VHF, they're vulnerable in different ways. Their vulnerabilities are different. It would be in some of the early discussions about using dual dissimilar or dual independent satellite voice capabilities in place of as a sole means long-range communication systems. The criteria are going to be looking at complete independence, what are the strengths, what are the vulnerabilities, and doing the full risk analysis and risk management process that would be done in any of this. So it's not going to be an easy process, and It's going to be looking at what are the differences in the technologies that are used, what is the pairing, and will they provide at least the same level of resilience as HF. And Craig, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think you did a good job.
Absolutely. Can you elaborate more on how the issue of interference will be handled, considering the footprint of satellite-based VHF for a given frequency will be much larger than ground-based radio?
Yeah, like I pointed out, the key difference with space-based VHF is that everything is at a bigger scale. So the coverage area is at a much larger scale, as is the interference ranges. The actual areas of the two, the ratio of those areas is roughly the same. Okay, so you don't run out of frequencies because you're using space-based VHF. It's obviously not a good system to use where you have very, very dense airspace and you want very small DOCs. But when you want large DOCs, it is entirely fit for purpose. Like I said, the tension comes as you get close to the areas where there is a lot of small DOCs. You know, Europe is a classic example. And to operate in the North Atlantic, we'll leave it to the ANSPs, who are actually the ones who will contract the service, to actually do the spectrum clearance. There's not a lot of frequencies required. It's a very small change required, knowing that it's painful. But you know, I've got a habit in life of never believing somebody when they tell you that their system is 100% full exactly. The chance of something being 100% allocated is actually quite low. In reality, it's 95% full, and you've actually already curtailed a bunch of services that would have taken you 120% of allocation. So it's telling you that it's painful. It's not telling you it's impossible.
Understood. What is the planned size of the constellations to be set in place by Skycraft?
Let me talk about all of them. I'll start with ours and answer the question directly. Our filing with the ITU is for 2,976 satellites, and our initial constellation, so what we plan to launch in the next year or two, is a couple of hundred. And as we increase our number of customers, we dramatically increase the number of satellites. There's no need to launch a very large number of satellites until customers sign up. The other advantage we have, and it sort of talks to the launches already booked for 2026, is that it takes us less than 12 months to go from deciding to expand the constellation to actually having the satellites on orbit, and that includes booking the launch. We don't need to plan things a long way in advance, which actually means we can wait for the commercial imperative and then follow the commercial imperative. And our investors insist on that kind of discipline. But as soon as there is enough ANSPs signed up to justify the launch of more satellites, then we can roll out more satellites. And we do expect to get close to that sort of almost 3,000 satellites within a decade. The number of satellites you can launch is about to dramatically expand. So those of you who follow spaceflight, you'll realise that if you weren't following tonight, SpaceX had a ground explosion of their next ship. But these are minor setbacks. When we started Skycraft in 2017, I asked every space professional, you know, like the heads of DARPA and other things like this, will the equivalent of Starship actually happen? And they said yes, and it'll be late. And they've been exactly right. When that system comes around, the cost of launching satellites drops by about a factor of 10 to 100. And so when you think I can only afford 200 satellites, it actually means you can afford 2,000. And you can do wonderful services with a very large number of satellites. You can control many, many parameters very precisely.
When do you anticipate that happening?
If we're betting for beers, then I would say you will see satellites being launched by Starship within 2 years, easily. And an ambitious person would say 12 months. I'll say 2 years.
What is the plan for harmonizing the VHF frequency between countries for the use of space-based VHF?
So, funnily enough, the VHF frequency planning at the moment is done in regions, and the regions are in general not always big enough to do this coordination. So it requires interregional coordination. And again, ICAO headquarters, MIA, and the frequency panel are working through that at the moment. And our plan realistically is that the early use cases, and we already have people clearing frequencies to deliver space-based VHF because they're right on the point of being in contract. At the moment, that will be an exemplar of how you do it. And the advantage is you're generally operating in fairly remote areas, so it's a relatively simple first couple of goes through it, and then we can work up to the more advanced ones. And but ICAO is in the process of standardising that. They already have processes to standardise regionally. You've just got to scale it up a little bit.
Understood. Which satellite orbit is preferred and which satellite band will be used?
Sorry, these for me again?
Yeah,
Is this for
sorry.
me, Lisa? No, it's fine. I just don't want to do all the talking. That's all. I'm very aware of. Share around the questions. So the orbits are different. So Star and Core have a 90-degree inclination orbit, so they strictly go over the poles like the Iridium satellites do. They're all low Earth orbits, so they're many hundreds of kilometers up, sort of 500 to 800 kilometers up, as opposed to the geostationary belt where they sit over a single point on the Earth's surface and they're sort of 30,000 kilometers away. We tend to use inclined orbits, and this means the satellites actually migrate around the Earth as well. But it's just really a choice of how you choose to roll out your constellation. We're all flying roughly between 400 and 800 kilometers for the low Earth orbit constellations, and the GEOs are, of course, GEO and have a very long track record of very reliable service.
Yeah, and to add to that, as far as what bands are used for the satellite voice, not space-based VHF, those services would be planned over L-band, and L-band is the protected safety spectrum. That's the service that we use right now for all of our aeronautical safety communications, including CPDLC and ADSC, and also support airline operations communications and aircraft control communications between aircraft systems and ground systems. Those L-band communications from Viasat are supplied by geosynchronous satellites that Craig just discussed. And with Iridium, they use a low Earth orbit satellite. And Craig also mentioned that in terms of their space-based VHF and Iridium services.
What are the primary causes of GPS signal loss or degradation during the final approach and landing phase, and what mitigation strategies are being implemented at the ANSP or airport level to ensure safe navigation continuity in such scenarios?
So this is really a question that's kind of beyond space-based voice. What we're seeing right now in terms of GPS interference, while there are some kind of localized issues, the biggest issue today is flights through or in proximity to conflict zones, such as the Middle East, such as India, Pakistan, such as Eastern Europe, the area around Ukraine. And when a flight that is particularly a flight where their GPS signal has been spoofed, that can affect a number of systems on the aircraft, and it can persist far longer than just the flight over the affected area. And while the aircraft's not targeted, they get affected by it, and it can continue throughout the entire flight. As far as, yeah, and if that happens, it can affect your landing capabilities. It can affect your terrain avoidance and collision avoidance systems, because the GNSS signal is kind of used throughout the aircraft systems and on a lot of ground systems. As far as mitigations, and neither Craig nor I are air traffic service providers, there is a huge effort globally to educate air traffic service providers, to work with pilots, airline operators, and air traffic service providers to recognize instances where an aircraft signal is incorrect, and where they've been affected. And some of the mitigations, and I'm not an expert on it, some of the mitigations would be to use ground-based navigational systems rather than the space-based and GPS-oriented systems, and to maintain that navigational network so that we're not reliant on GPS signals. the big issue is being able to recognize when a flight has been spoofed and to be able to then transition to an alternative methodology. And Nikki or Craig, I don't know if you want to add to that.
I think you did.
I can add a tiny bit to it, I guess. And it answers another question there, Nikki. So certainly, I would expect all of the space-based VHF providers to also do ADS-B. It's a natural complement. It fits onto the spacecraft relatively easily, doesn't add a real lot to the cost, and adds to the services. And of course, this then gives the advantage with the existing Ariane service, like I mentioned before, with comms, that you get the advantage of dual redundancy if you want it. So you've got two different service providers. There's some common mode failures where you're both space-based. And people will be concerned about space weather and other events, even though there hasn't been a huge number of failures with anything we've seen in history. But it is still a theoretical concern, and one where you do get a first-time event. And naturally, then with that, you start to do wide area multilateration and so on. And in fact, we can do better than WAM. There's a number of different techniques can be used. I've been teaching people how to geolocate radio emitters since last century, so I'm quite comfortable doing that. And where you actually get to very quickly with that is better than radar location knowledge of the ADS-B emitter. You don't need to use the ADS-B position at all. You can geolocate the aircraft off any of its ADS-B transmissions. So as long as it keeps squawking, you could actually do radar vectoring of an aircraft that's lost, noting that then requires controllers to be doing that and so on. But it is a radar-like performance if you wanted.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Lisa. Is there any study conducted to determine the influence of airports around the mountainous areas and frequently affected by heavy clouds on signal strength and quality? I'm not sure if either one of you could possibly touch on that, may or may not be able to.
Well, so they're very different questions. And I will say this, one of the reasons that L-band is used for SATCOM rather than other frequencies, and this is sat voice, not space-based VHF, is because it's not as vulnerable to interference from precipitation, so clouds and rain and that type of thing. And of course, because a geosynchronous satellite and even a LEO is so high, you don't tend to be as affected by mountainous terrain. It's not, the line of sight is from the top down rather than terrestrial line of sight. And Craig, I'll let you.
Yeah, I'll actually take the wind out of my own sail a little bit here. What Lisa said is totally correct for geostationary SATCOM. And certainly it's also correct that at VHF we're even less affected by rain, but in effect neither signal is affected by rain or cloud or anything like that. Low Earth orbit satellites are not always directly overhead. Much of the time you're actually quite low on the horizon. So you do get shadowing from mountainous terrain. So you imagine, deep valleys, Switzerland or these sorts of places. You do have a problem if you have a low density constellation. So if you've only got 1 or 2 satellites above the horizon, much of the time they're only going to be 10, 15, 20 degrees above the horizon. So you do run the risk of certain airports being affected by shadowing from nearby terrain. As you increase the number of satellites in the constellation, then you can very quickly guarantee to have a satellite high overhead, and you do start to approach that level of service provided by GEO. You'll never quite meet it, well, unless you've launched Starlink, right? It's got thousands of satellites, but in general, you're still not quite as good as GEO, but it's now no longer such an issue. But certainly in the early days, this is why I didn't want to promise we can do VHF on the ground, for example. We can do VHF to close to the ground. But certainly, guaranteeing you can do it while you're taxiing has a number of different propagation effects that we need to get a very good handle on, get very good collected data, and prove that it's safe before we start offering that as a service. And it would require densifying the constellation. It's not a geostationary type service.
All right, thank you. I'm just going through the questions, and it looks like we touched on we answered majority of them. Some we touched in other answers when we were answering earlier questions.
There was a latency one, Nikki, and I'll point out the VHF latency. I would expect all of the providers to have quite low latency. We're talking latency in the tens of milliseconds, not the hundreds of milliseconds. So because you have the radio discipline of press to talk, you don't expect to see any real trouble. If I use the example of Australia, again, air services have remote VHF sites where they actually relay via geostationary satellites to get there. Because there are no terrestrial cables going in there. Again, Australia resembles a great big ocean. There's not cabling to all of the country. So they already serve VHF traffic over geostationary, and there's no major complaints from either the pilots or the controllers. But our demonstrated latency will be in the tens of milliseconds. It'll be fine.
Thank you very much, Craig. All right, so I just want to thank the audience for their questions. Very much appreciated. And I will go ahead and start closing out this webinar. And I just really wanted to thank the CANSO events team for their work. And I apologize because there's one more question. Are the providers planning on centralized, consolidated ground stations or customer site specific ground stations?
Lisa, do you have a starting on that with your press to talk?
Okay, so for, well, we don't do press to talk, we do.
Well, close. Almost.
So every satellite service provider and space-based VHF provider will have a different setup. As far as Viasat goes, we have a number of grounder stations around the world, and we provide primary and alternate paths. So if one ground Earth station has an issue, we have a secondary path that's already identified, and we transition to that. As far as geosynchronous satellites, it takes 3 satellites to cover the surface of the Earth. And so you don't have an issue of satellite being within line of sight of the ground Earth stations, because we do have a number of ground Earth stations. With some LEO satellite configurations, depending on the size of the orbit and the configuration of the orbit, and as Craig has mentioned, every satellite's different and every constellation is different. And depending on the proximity of the satellites to the ground Earth stations, signal might have to be relayed from satellite to satellite at some number of satellites before it can be transitioned to the ground Earth station. So it's constellation dependent. And now I'll turn it back over to you, Craig.
Yeah. So again, our view on this is that it's largely at the discretion of the customer as to how we provide that. Our general preference is that it is simplest and most affordable to actually put multiple redundant stations on their premises as close to the control center as possible. Now, occasionally some of those control centers will have spectrum management problems for getting up and down. We generally serve over X-band, which normally isn't too bad. But as an example, if we were to deal with Australia, all of Australia's en route and oceanic traffic is done out of one of 2 big cities in Melbourne or Brisbane. And so we would look to put multiple units on the airfield at Melbourne and the airfield in Brisbane, and run that directly into the ANSP's data systems. We don't like putting ground stations 50 kilometres away in a radio quiet zone and then have the complication of trying to route fibre. Your fibre providers are quite limited because of the latency problems and so on, and it just brings in another failure mode for the system. So in general, it's not a large system that's required. The data rates are very low. The dishes can be quite small. There's a number of different solutions. So we look for cost-effective solutions for each customer, but in general, it's very simple. We put the downlink directly next to the air traffic controller that's going to use it.
Thank you both, Craig and Lisa. And I'm going to circle back around to an earlier question. I believe we covered it, but just to touch on it, does one-stage sat voice dial require development integration into the ATC system?
So if you're using it for direct pilot controller communications, then it would have to be integrated into the voice switch. And so you would work with a communication service provider and your staff to do that integration into your voice switch.
And I believe there was also in an area where already with 8.33 megahertz spacing, there are not enough frequencies to cope with the needed sector. How does space-based VHF play a role? And Craig, you kind of answered this question. I'm not sure if you'd like to earlier, not sure if you'd like to elaborate a little bit more.
I mean, not really. Again, the key thing here is that negotiation of frequencies takes place between the ANSPs, or in North America sometimes with the airline Andy Roy's area. But we don't sort of buy into it. We provide the best technical capabilities we can, the best frequency reuse we can, the best management of the footprints that we can. And it's up to the ANSP to find the frequencies that will actually support this. In general, if it's a very large value proposition, then there's always a way. You can always find a way. If it's not a high value proposition, then yes, frequency congestion will become one of those limiting factors that limits where you apply it.
Thank you. All right. I'm not sure if, okay. That last question, Lisa, Craig, I don't believe it's applicable, but the question was, are you both going to get certified by EASA? So I'm not.
So right now, we don't get certified. Our services we don't get certified by a regulator. However, the air navigation service provider and the states conduct their safety risk management and safety analysis and go through their certification and approval processes. And for L-band services, generally, one of the key vehicles for getting a new service and new constellation approved, and this doesn't address space-based VHF, would be through the FAA's Park Communication Working Group, and that's a performance-based aviation rulemaking committee, communication work group, and so we'll be conducting multi-year trials generally and providing that information to the FAA, Park, CWG, and then they tend to both provide recommendations to the FAA's regulatory arm and also provide information to the other regulators around the world to help inform their approval process. That's a common thing. And one of the things that you're seeing is FAA Park CWG has sponsored trials for satellite voice. And right now the FAA is currently conducting a trial, as has Singapore. So it's not that you get regulatory certification. It's a little different. And Craig?
Yeah, I would say roughly the same thing, that it's the ANSP that needs the approval of their regulator, and that as you sell to each ANSP, their regulator comes and has a look and demands data and does audits and so on. You don't get a certificate out of that, but it does mean that each time you sell to a new ANSP, it gets easier because they start to look around and realize that other people have already done the homework, and there's a data pack there to help them, and most of their questions have already been answered. So it's roughly the same as Lisa said. It's not a certification step, but it is necessary that we do expose what we're doing to the safety regulator and they get comfortable with it.
More of a process. All right. So I believe second time around, that was, I think, it. So Again, thank you all for your questions from the audience. And prior to closing out the webinar, I would very much like to thank both Ruth and Sam, who are part of the CANSO events team, for their work to make this webinar possible. I again would really like to thank both Lisa and Craig for sharing your expertise and vision with us today in reference to space-based voice communications and technologies. Your insight was both with both operational challenges and future opportunities, and answering all the questions were very valuable. And again, special thanks to all of you who joined and contributed to the question session. I believe today's session sparked new ideas and collaboration opportunities, and just thank you for the collaboration and conversation. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded and it will be on the CANSO site within the next week or so, and the presentation slides will be available for CANSO members. If you have any additional questions for our speakers, please feel free to email me at operations@canso.org, and we'll be more than happy to get your answers, your questions answered. I sincerely hope you enjoyed this webinar. Please stay connected with us at CANSO, and as we continue advancing innovation in global air traffic management. And until next time, thank you and take care.